Okay, now that we talked about that the heart is made up of a right side and a left side, deoxygenated blood on the right side, oxygenated blood on the left side, and then we talked about what actual parts of the heart blood flows through, the chambers that we talked about and the valves. Let's look at conduction now, very important component of the heart, and then we'll really truly see how blood is flowing through the heart. And I know what I talked about with the last video, how blood, I talked about just the right side first, and then I talked about the left side. That's just, blood doesn't flow exactly like that, because as blood is flowing through the right side, it's not that there's no blood on the left side at that same time. So let's go through the conduction system, and then we'll see exactly how blood is flowing through the heart at one time. And so first things first is that most of the heart is made up of cardiac muscle. All right, so there is connective tissue there, but most of it's cardiac muscle, and we already had our lecture on muscle. We get it. We get the idea that muscle, for it to work, it has to become excited. All right, so typically what distributed or commanded the muscle to become excited was the neuron. All right, now what's very interesting about the heart, however, is that there's a group of cells, not that much that makes up the entire heart, but they're very interesting in that they don't have to receive a command from neurons. Okay, they can actually become excited on their own. All right, and we remember excitation indicates the fact that a cell can generate an action potential. So we're talking about a special type of muscle cell that can generate an action potential on its own. Right? A lot of times, however, a neuron does actually give a command to those cells, but they can do it on their own. And those cells are called autorhythmic cells. They only make up 2% of the cardiac muscle in the heart. The other 98% are contractile cells that actually do the work of contracting once they become excited. But these are very interesting cells called autorhythmic cells. Like we mentioned in lecture, these are the very small percentage that makes up the heart, but they are controlling the heart. They're going to conduct the heart, as I noted in lecture. They're the conductors, okay? They'll say when the atria contracts and when the ventricles contract. All right, and so that is a huge feature as it relates to how well the heart will function. A lot of people might have issues with those autorhythmic cells when they get older, or if they're born with a genetic scenario related to that. And that's a big impact that it would have on how well the heart functions if there's dysfunction. And we'll see that in a second. So basically, let's look at these autorhythmic cells, but I do want to add that, like we mentioned in lecture, that cardiac muscle cells are different from your actual smooth muscle cells and skeletal muscle cells that we talked about in chapter 10, because they have gap junctions between them. And those gap junctions are called intercalated disc. All right, so gap junctions, don't forget, we talked about that. We was at chapter 4, epithelial cells could have that scenario, or there was called gap junctions. If one epithelial cell had something, it could communicate to another one as it relates to contents that's in that cell can just be distributed to the next cell through a channel. It's very interesting. Something that we also saw with chapter 6 with the actual osteocyte. You have osteocytes distributing oxygen and nutrients to each other through gap junctions. So that's what's very special about cardiac muscle. And if one actual cardiac muscle cell becomes excited, then the next one will be, right? Because they have gap junctions between them. Those gap junctions are called intercalated discs. So what you're going to see is this spread of excitation throughout the heart. All right, and so that's very, very interesting, and that's a concept we must know as it relates to what's going on with how conduction occurs through the heart. All right, so let's look at that. We'll start with our first group of autorhythmic cells. Don't forget, they make up a real small percentage of the heart. But this first group that we're going to look at is called the SA node. It's a group of autorhythmic cells right there in the right atrium. If this is the heart, we have our chambers, which is the right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. Okay? And so don't forget, you have your fibrous skeleton that divides right down the middle, right? So that way, your right side of the heart is separated from your left side of the heart. Okay? And then there's also an actual transverse section, if you will, of the fibrous skeleton that makes up most of the valves. Okay, very important in this process, where now you're not going to have atrial contractile cells connected with intercalated disc with your ventricular contractile cells. So that we'll come back to that in a second. So that's very important as well. All right, but we definitely have our heart divided up. Okay. And so we'll come back to how that's influential, but we already know that that divide right down the middle is very helpful, making sure deoxygenated blood does not mix with oxygenated blood. All right, so let's look at your SA node. Let's look at these autorhythmic cells that will end up being, they'll start the actual pace of the heart as far as it relates to electrical conduction. So we call them pacemaker cells. That's the pacemaker of the actual heart, your SA node. It will either on itself become excited, but most of the time we have the neuron, specifically one coming from the brain, that's actually going to give it a command to become excitable. All right, so let's start with that and say that the neuron gives that command, and then you have that whole synapse process we talked about with chapter 10, and then you have neurotransmitters binding to receptors on the cells of these autorhythmic cells, and then opening up sodium channels, if you will, right? So the sodium channels now depolarization occurs, and then you'll get an action potential. All right, so basically that's what's going to happen here at these actual autorhythmic cells called the pacemaker, the SA node. And then all of them become excitable. Now, they don't do anything. They don't actually do any contracting. That's interesting. It's a muscle cell, and you know, chapter 10, we said, as soon as you have excitation of that cell, that muscle cell, right, it goes down that T-tubule to the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and then you have the actual calcium going into the sarcoplasm. Now you're going to actually be able to have what you call the contraction cycle, right? So you relate. Let's make sure we do that. Let's make sure we relate and couple what? Excitation with what? Contraction. Excitation is coupled with what? Contraction. So typically you'll have muscle cells when they become excited contract. But these autorhythmic cells are special. They don't actually contract, okay? We have our other 98% of the heart cardiac muscle cells doing that, which are called contractile cells. You get it? They actually are called contractile cells because they contract. Your autorhythmic don't do that. Their whole purpose is to distribute this excitation to the contractile cells. So what you have around them is plenty of contractile cells that are in the right and left atria. And so what they're going to do is once the autorhythmic cells become excited, they're going to take that action potential and spread it. Remember how they're going to spread it again? Let's see if you were remembering. You remember what I talked about before. Intercalated discs, gap junctions. Gap junctions are between autorhythmic cells and contractile cells. Okay? So what you're going to have is your autorhythmic cells, once they become excited, spread this action potential to all the other contractile cells around it and spread it throughout the right and left atrium. Okay? Very fast situation that occurs. So what you're going to have is, as soon as your contractile cells become excited, they contract. So that means your right and left atria contract at the same time. All right, so this is where I go to, talking about how we'll really get into what the true flow of the actual blood through the heart is, which is blood is going to flow or be squeezed, right? See, squeezed from your right and left atria at the same time through your atrioventricular valves at the same time, right? What's the one on the right? It's called the tricuspid valve. The one on the left side is called the mitral or bicuspid valve. And then blood gets squeezed down to the ventricles. So your right and left ventricle receive blood at the same time. Okay, so this is a little different what I talked about with my previous video. So we can visualize that blood is going from right atria and left atria at the same time down to the right and left ventricle at the same time. And it was this process of your conductors that said that's what will happen. Right? So your SA node spreading that action potential throughout the rest of the contractile cells, right, causes them to contract, and that contraction is what's pushing the blood down to the ventricles from the atria. Okay? All right, so this is our process. Now, this is what's special, and this is what we have to bring up in this process. It's very important. I said I was going to come back to it, and that's that your actual fiber skeleton, that transverse plane cut of that fiber skeleton there, here, that's making up most of the valves, that dense connective tissue has now separated your atrial contractile cells from your ventricular contractile cells. Okay, so just like I said in the lecture, don't forget. Okay, typically your contractile cells and all the rhythmic cells are what connected by gap junctions called intercalated disc. But your fiber skeleton is actually disconnecting your atrial contractile cells from your ventricular contractile cells. All right, so what's really happening here then is that yes, your right atria and left atria contract at the same time. All right, but your ventricles aren't going to contract at the same time, right? So this spread of action potential does not spread down to the ventricles. Why? Because that fiber skeleton, that dense connective tissue, has now separated these contractile cells from the ones from the atria, from the ventricle. So therefore, you can't have the spread. I'll repeat that, right? You cannot have a spread of action potential from contractile cells of the atria to the ventricular contractile cells because there is an actual wall there blocking it, okay? The fiber skeleton is blocking, and it's great that that's the case, right? Just like I said in lecture, because you want your ventricles to fill up. Picture that balloon filling up with water. You want your actual what? Ventricles to fill up with blood, okay, before they actually contract. All right, so you do want a separation there, and that's beautiful. So now your ventricles fill up. Your ventricles fill up. Now there will be a connection eventually, and it's because of the rest of the autorhythmic cells in this conduction system. What picked up an action potential on the lower portion of your atria, your right atria, was your atrioventricular node. The AV node is also a group of autorhythmic cells that will now actually distribute amongst themselves an action potential extremely slow. They're like turtles, right? As it relates to distributing an action potential amongst themselves through intercalated disc. So they do it so slow, right? And so as they're distributing action potentials amongst themselves, what's happening? Your ventricles are filling up. Your right and left ventricle are filling up. So that's perfect. You want that. You want this slow process of spread of an action potential, all right, to occur at this node here, all right, before this spread of action potential can actually go to the ventricle. So that's great for filling. That's what your AV node is for. AV node is there to slow down the actual conduction process so that your ventricles can fill, right? Eventually, they do actually distribute it to the next set of autorhythmic cells, called what we call the actual AV bundle, okay? So it goes from AV node to what we call the AV bundle of His, which now is a bridge that crosses this now. This is what? Excitation, action potential that's now crossing that bridge, what we call the fiber skeleton, that was separating the contractile cells of atria from the contractile cells of the ventricle. So now we bridge that scenario there where now excitation continues through the what? The bundle of His, all right? And then ends up going to the what? Right bundle branch and the left bundle branch, okay? Still, this spread of action potential is only occurring through autorhythmic cells. It has not gotten to your contractile cells of your ventricle yet. Still, what's happening in this process? Your ventricles are filling up. Is that good? That's perfect. You want your ventricles to fill all the way up with blood as much as they can. All right, now it's going to end up going from right and left bundle branches to what we call the Purkinje fibers. And those Purkinje fibers are now the last set of algorithmic cells that now spread this action potential to what we call the contractile cells of the what? Ventricle. Of the right and left ventricle. Okay, so now all of those cells around these Purkinje fibers are going to receive an action potential. And now what are we going to get? A spread of what action potential through all the ventricular contractile cells, the right and left ventricles, at the same time. And you know what I said that is coupled with excitation? Contraction. So now we have actual contractile cells, cardiac muscle cells that will contract, and they contract. And we're going to spread that action potential throughout the right and left ventricle, and that's why the right and left ventricle contracts at the same time. And what's that going to do? Push the blood up for the right ventricle through the pulmonic valve to the pulmonary artery, and for the left ventricle through the aortic valve to the aorta. And now all the blood from the aorta goes to the tissues of your body. Okay? And that's the flow of blood. Okay? Flow of blood is from what? Right and left atria at the same time, down to the right and left ventricle. Okay, they get filled up. That blood gets filled up, and then eventually the right and left ventricle contracts and pushes the blood up to the great vessels, which are called the pulmonary artery, that are taking blood from the right side of the heart, and the aorta taking blood from the left side of the heart. All right? And then that's where we get blood where it has to go. For the pulmonary artery, it goes to the lungs to become oxygenated. And from the aorta, it takes blood oxygenated to the actual what? Tissues of your body so it can get oxygen and nutrients. And that's what it's all about, creating blood pressure. Pressure created so that blood can be pushed to tissues to get oxygen and nutrients. Beautiful.